Thank you. We are now in public session. Okay, we're now in public session. Before we begin, can I please remind members and witnesses to turn off their mobile phones. Interference from mobile phones affects sound quality. I would like to welcome today Ronnie Downs, Assistant Secretary, and I would also like to welcome Joan Burton, Principal Officer, and Caroline O'Loughlin, Assistant Principal from the Department of Public Expenditure Reform. We are meeting today regarding the report entitled Public Performance Report 2018. And so before we get into that, I would just like to do a little bit of the housekeeping privilege note. I wish to advise you that by virtue of Section 17(2)(1) of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect to their evidence to the committee. However, if you are directed by the committee to cease giving evidence on a particular matter and continue to do so, you are entitled thereafter only to qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You are directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that, where possible, you should not criticise or make charges against any person or entity by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. Members are reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that they should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside the Houses or an official either by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. So I'd like to thank you all for attending here today. And Mr Downs, I now invite you to make your opening statement to us.
Thank you very much, Chair. It's a pleasure to be here today to appear before this committee, and thank you for the invitation. And it's good to have the opportunity to present before the committee and to discuss our public service performance report, which I understand you all have copies of, just published today. We're happy to answer any questions that you may have about the report and about the performance budgeting more generally and its role within the overall public expenditure framework. The Public Service Performance Report 2018 places into the public domain a wide range of indicators, both qualitative and quantitative, covering just about all areas of public expenditure, with a view to promoting evidence-based discussion on the impacts and the achievements of public spending. Of course, when it comes to the detail in relation to any issues in particular departments and specific performance indicators, relevant line departments are best placed to go into the minutiae of it, but we'll do our best to give a flavour of what's dealt with in the report today. Back in June 2016, the government submission at the time to the Select Committee on Arrangements for Budgetary Scrutiny committed to the publication of this annual performance report by the Minister for Public Expenditure and Reform at the end of Q1 in 2017. The Public Service Performance Report for the year 2016 was duly published then in April 2017, and then the following year we produced one in April 2018, and this year's report in respect of 2018 is published this morning, and so it's the third edition of this performance report. Now, the purpose and the objective of this report is to build on existing elements of the performance-based budgeting initiative. In other words, to go beyond a focus just on how much is being spent with public money, to see also what's been achieved and accomplished with public spending, and to create a space in the budget process for a performance dialogue and a tool for parliamentarians to use to engage with the various departmental and ministerial counterparts. Now, while performance information it's already provided at some level alongside the financial information in the revised estimates volume that's produced in December, outturn information for the current year can't be provided at that time because of the December timing of the REV publication. So this means that committees may not have the relevant information to assess performance for the most recent year in a timely manner at that period. So the performance report attempts to address this shortfall by providing quantitative information on what exactly was delivered with public funds in 2018. That's what we're trying to achieve. And so this will create an opportunity, as I say, for meaningful dialogue between ministers, relevant sectoral committees on government performance, and the information provided in the report is intended to assist the relevant committees in tracking progress in relation to outputs and outcomes of the key government strategies. The report also aims to support an enhanced focus on performance and delivery more generally by presenting relevant performance indicators in a a dedicated, focused document where it's all brought together in one place. So ideally then this would enable the committees to make best use of the time available for reviewing performance measures across the different areas. And to say some words about equality budgeting also, this document integrates an update on the equality budgeting initiative. The equality budgeting pilot initiative was implemented in 2018, and at that stage, that's last year, we identified 6 equality objectives, and an update on the pilot was included in last year's performance report. So to build on that initiative and the momentum achieved in that pilot, Minister Donoghue announced back in October in his budget speech that he was broadening the scope of equality budgeting to further develop the gender budgeting elements at its core, but also to broaden the scope to other dimensions of equality and inclusiveness, such as poverty, socio-economic inequality and disability. So as part of this development, an appendix to equality budgeting was included in the revised estimates volume 2019 back in December, and that outlined an equality budgeting framework to form an organisational frame of reference for how this information should be presented. It identified 9 themes that were selected to best align with the established government strategies of equality, and the themes that are identified allow for a sector-by-sector examination, and they highlight areas which need further attention. So, in addition to the original 6 equality objectives that were identified in the pilot, we call that Phase 1, a further 8 equality objectives have been added in 2019, that's Phase 2. So this means, as of now, 9 government departments are actively engaged with equality budgeting, and an update on each of the objectives and each of the progress under these elements is set out in Part 3 at the back of this performance report. However, from our point of view in the department, we need to move beyond, and we're moving beyond the piloting phase of this initiative to promote a mainstreaming of this approach as a policy frame of reference, as a policy instrument to be employed across all spending areas. So that's what we'll be moving on to next, and we'll be looking for input and insights of the committee as to how best to do that. Also, to assist in the moving forward of this initiative, an advisory group was set in place last year, an equality budgeting expert advisory group to assist with the rollout, and that draws on a wide range of independent and academic and critical perspectives to help shape and lend momentum to this public service-wide initiative. And the expert group has met several times to date, and they have certainly brought a very positive forward momentum to our project. So, building on these developments, the Department of Justice and Equality, who are not here today, but they have worked closely with us, and they've commissioned the OECD to undertake a policy study of equality budgeting in Ireland to take stock of the actions that we've taken so far, to mainstream equality considerations as part of the budget process. And the OECD study also aims to provide some options and recommendations on future directions for equality budgeting in Ireland in light of international experience, including in gender budgeting. So a delegation from OECD are expected in the coming weeks, and their report should be finalised in advance of the October budget and could feed into our budgetary deliberations. Just to conclude, Deputy Chair, with some words on next steps. An ambitious work plan for both the performance budgeting policy and also the expert advisory group on equality budgeting is now in place for the coming year, and it aims to continue, as I say, the momentum to date and further advance this work. Some of the key challenges that we plan to address include levels of awareness and engagement in the initiative as public service-wide, some data gaps which kind of hamper getting clear signals in particular areas and clear indicators, and basically broadening the number of participating departments to make this a mainstreamed initiative. And as this is the 3rd year of the Public Service Performance Report, it's timely to explore and to get your feedback on whether the format can be enhanced and refined as we move forward. This process will likely involve consultation with departments and seek to have better linkages between, for example, the ongoing work that goes on spending review, the broad range of analytical papers that are produced by the Irish Government Economic and Evaluation Service, and also the evolution of better performance data and metrics at a sector-by-sector level. And so some questions that require reflection for us include whether we have the right range of performance indicators. Are they helpful to you in the job that you do? Do we have too many indicators or too few? What works for you in your role as parliamentarians? In trying to capture a lot of the activity that takes place across the broad range of sectors, we need to be careful that we don't lose sight of the big high-level goals that our citizens can connect to. So that's something, again, we're mindful of. So in light of these reflections, then, I hope that we've put into the public domain a broad range, a useful snapshot, I think, of the breadth of public service activity, helping to shine a light onto particular areas of interest in particular topics. So we'll also, as I say, we're anxious to get your feedback as members of the Oireachtas on how to develop the report so that it best supports your scrutiny needs, and we'll endeavour to advance this report, bring it forward, adapt it, so as best to facilitate your work. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Do I have any questions? Deputy Barrett, yes? Oh, sorry, I just thought you were indicating if you're okay, that's grand.
No, I don't really.
Okay. Well, can I say it is? Thank you for your very interesting opening statement and your analysis of the report. It's a lot in it. There's a lot of information dumped there on it, and we do appreciate that. It will form part of our work as a committee. In terms of our ongoing work, we do appreciate that. I'm going to say, in light of that, I'm going to thank you for coming in. You're going to get, I think, a let off early today on it. I particularly welcome the developments, though, that you have on the equality budgeting and the broadening of that programme. It is something that we as a committee, particularly on the gender budgeting side, had looked at before. It's a thing we wanted to see. We believe we can be a European leader in this area. In terms of, not a world leader in this area, in terms of looking at it as a project. We welcome the commitment of the Minister in that regard as well. So we look forward to seeing the developments in that. But with that, I'm going to thank you very much for your presentation and your information today. And we will now take, I think, a small break and go into private session to allow us to bring in our next group. So thank you very much. Session, and we are now in public session. So I would like to welcome to our second session today the Disability Federation of Ireland, and I would like to welcome Dr. Joanne McCarthy, Senior Executive Officer, Policy and Research, and accompanied today by Joanne O'Donnell, Development Manager, and Fiona O'Donovan, Policy and Research Assistant. Thank you for making yourselves available to the committee. We're meeting with you to discuss the approach to disability proofing the budget. It's a useful opportunity at our stage in our committee's work to consider the progress that has been made in introducing the equality budgeting pilot programme and your views as a national stakeholder. So just before we start, can I do just the privilege statement and read it out? I wish to advise you that by virtue of Section 17(2)(I) of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of their evidence to the committee. However, if you are directed by the committee to cease giving evidence on a particular matter and continue to do so, you are entitled thereafter only to qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You are directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that, where possible, you should not criticise or make charges against any person or entity by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. Members are again reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that they should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside the House of the Oireachtas, an official either by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. So I'd just like to note that, and also just to make the usual note in relation to telephones and their impact on recording of our work here. Yes. Yes, sir. Which, as everybody knows, nobody switches off their phone. But anyway, I'd like to, obviously, to commence our session by thanking you again for attending here. And Dr. McCarthy, I would now like to invite you to make your opening statement to the committee.
Thank you. Thank you very much to the deputies also for inviting us to participate in this. This is the second year in a row that we've participated, so I suppose we're building on our submission that we made to you last year. For those of you who don't know, DFI is a national support organisation with a membership of over 120 member organisations. They span a range of very small to very large household organisations. You can go on our website and you'll get a better understanding of what we do, but we do three main things. We support the development of organisations to provide good quality services. We're involved in informing and monitoring policy and disability policies and procedures, and then we support the participation of people with disabilities at local, national and international level also. I suppose just to say, look, that when we came here last year, we were calling for disability to be included as part of the equality budgeting process, and we acknowledge the developments that have taken place since then. In particular, we acknowledge the establishment of the budgetary expert advisory group in September, and also the commitment that was made in Budget 2019, and for that he must be commended for having heard and listened to us and actually implemented these things. However, I suppose even before those, we just want to remind people that there is already a commitment, a state commitment to budgeting for people with disabilities in mind under Section 42 of the Irish Human Rights and Equality Act from 2014. The state already has responsibility to ensure that public bodies take into account measures to ensure that they affect in a positive way people with disabilities. I suppose we also, known as public sector duty, this also extends to disability proofing your budgets. And I suppose even though we commend the developments that happened in 2018, we see them more in terms of delivering on the Programme for Government's commitment to disability proofing. Obviously, all of this has to be now put in the context of the UNCRPD, the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which we ratified in 2018. So I'm not going to go and talk to you about what it is in terms of the key high-level goals around equality proofing in general, because I'm sure as a committee you all know this. I suppose what DFI will do is that we have taken the time to consider what was committed to, and now in light of the report that came out today, we've had a quick look to see what has actually been formally achieved. I suppose our initial comment was that we feel that although the commitment, the establishment of the working group and the stitching of disability into equality proofing measures is a positive thing, that we feel that what has been delivered falls significantly short of what should be achieved if you're going to disability proof budgets. My colleagues here will give you, will probably highlight some of the key areas that they feel would need further development. So Fiona on my left will talk a little bit around on my right, thank you, we'll talk a little bit around the lack of ambition that's even there when it comes to proofing disability-specific stuff within health, and then when it goes out into other areas such as housing. And my colleague Joan on my left will talk in particular around what it means in the context of poverty and social welfare. But before we go on, I suppose I just want to take the opportunity for us just to take a step back for just a minute and just to consider, when we talk about disability proofing for people with disabilities, who is it that we're actually talking about? Because oftentimes when we talk in policy and legislation and even in budget terms, it has a very different interpretation of the population at hand. We know, according to Census 2016, that there's over 600,000 people have identified having a disability. That's 13.5% of the population. When we talk about disability and disabled people, we often zone in on those that receive services predominantly through the disability services budget in particular. But you have to bear in mind that only 27,000 people of that 630,000 people with disabilities in Ireland receive day services, and of that only 8,500 people of that group receive residential services. So when we talk about disability proofing the budget, if we only look at disability proofing health budgets and specifically disability budgets, that's falling quite significantly short of the population of disabled people in general. So I suppose at that point I'm going to hand you over to my colleagues, but we do encourage you to just keep that in mind, that when you are thinking about budgets, you have to think about beyond those 35,000 people that are in receipt of disability core services in general. Fiona.
With permission of the Chair, I'll just, I suppose, just expand us very slightly on what Joanne actually set out there. So just to come back to the revised estimates for public services 2019, in our submission we set out that the Appendix 10 of that lists all of the different indicators set out thematically. There are 9 themes. Disability now has its own theme since the budget announcement last year. That's theme number 2, ensure people with disabilities have equal opportunities and supports. So let's just start by saying there are some very encouraging indicators within that. We note in particular there are moves to focus on the more community-based supports. So if you look under health, for example, it does focus on community-based supports. So one of the indicators is the number of personal assistant hours provided to persons with a physical and/or sensory disability. And there will be others like this throughout, which do focus on more putting people with a disability in the community, and that is huge move in the right direction and very much in line with the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. But our concern would be that it's not actually measuring what needs to be measured. It's very much measuring the low-hanging fruit. So you're not going to get the outcomes from it that you're actually aiming to try and secure. An example of that is if you look at, again, personal assistance hours. So personal assistance services is a fundamental way support to people to actually not just get up out of bed, but to get out into their community and to actually participate in society, participate in employment, participate in education, participate in sports, cultural, whatever activities it may be, to be part of the community. So if the measurement is how many hours are being allocated overall, it's failing to go into the detail of that. Because what needs to be measured is how many people are getting those hours. How many hours are those are being allocated per person? So is it an hour a couple of hours in the morning, a couple of hours at night? That basically it serves to get someone up out of bed or put someone back into bed, but nothing about getting out and living life. So that's really what we mean about it needs to go further and really measure the core things. Moreover, it also needs to be looking at how many people are not getting those hours. Is there a waiting list? How do we even know what the unmet need is around that? Are we classifying things correctly? And there will be issues around conflating and I suppose an overlap between what would be termed as home care services, separate to personal assistance services. Home care would be more that basic, get up, get ready for the day type of support, and personal assistant then really is aimed at moving out into the community. So really we will be looking to try and encourage more in-depth indicators that will really get down to the kernel issue. I suppose just another, and I'll just skirt over it, another example of that would be in the housing. So we see that there are only two indicators in relation to housing, one in relation to special needs units, another in relation to grants that are available. But for example, people with disabilities are one of the highest groupings of people who qualify for social housing need in the annual social housing needs assessments. So what we'd be looking to see is, well, are we counting how many houses or social housing units are allocated to people with disabilities per year? That would be a useful indicator. And there are a lot more that we need to be, I suppose, drilling down into the detail on to really get the impact. Moving on from that then, I suppose what we'd like to highlight is that the United Nations Convention really encourages, yes, certainly we should have disability-specific measures, such as such as the theme number 2, where we're really trying to target the very particular situation for people with disabilities. But also what we need to see is mainstreaming. And mainstreaming means that we should be able to see disability being considered and thread throughout all these initiatives. So if you consider that, the other themes, another example of the theme is number 5, equality to access to housing. We would be asking, is disability considerations being evidenced within that theme as well, and throughout all the different themes? An example from last year's budget, which we could give, is the government did announce a tax incentive around repair works that would be provided. But we don't know if that tax incentive is now available for improvements in terms of accessibility. So we're not sure what the meaning is of improvements, and we did pose a question to the Minister. To my knowledge, we haven't yet received a definitive on that yet. So that's what we mean when we talk about mainstreaming into the budget proofing. So I'll leave it there, and my colleague Joan will take over.
Okay, thanks, Fiona. I have 4 very brief points to make. And they're all concerned with social protection, income, and employment measures to ensure better equality proofing of budgets going forward. The first thing I'd like to point out is, just to build on the stats that Joanne and Fiona have shared with you, is that there are 154,351 people in Ireland living in consistent poverty. And that's one of the highest rates of any groups. And these figures are based on income figures, not based on goods and services and how much money those people need to pay out. So that we would say that grossly underestimates the numbers of people in Ireland who are living in consistent poverty, who have a disability. And this is something that really needs to be addressed in equality budgeting and disability proofing budgets. We welcome the measures being undertaken by Minister Regina Doherty to look at the cost of disability and caring, and would see that an urgent need that any work done under that is stitched into equality budgeting. We would also like to make some comment on the Minister's intentions to benchmark social welfare payments. We believe that they should be based on the minimum essential standard of living, which is a lot of work done by the Vincentian Partnership, rather than being tied to the Consumer Price Index. Okay, we think that the issue of income adequacy is one that would need to be addressed in a way that will lift people above the poverty line and ensure that people's rights and dignity to a minimum income is secured. This is something that is provided for not only under the United Nations Convention of the Rights of People with Disabilities, but also the European Pillar of Social Rights, which states that everybody that people have a right to live with dignity and to have an adequate minimum income that they can live, that raises them above the poverty line. Okay, we would say that the Consumer Price Index is of little relevance to the lived circumstance of people with disabilities reliant on social welfare, and the Central Statistics Office would also concur that it's not a reflection of the cost of living and acts purely as a price index. The Vincentians have done a lot of work on a minimum essential standard of living, which we would advocate for instead. The fourth point that I would like to make is that we need to keep in mind measures for those with disabilities who wish to work and who could stay in work. We know that it's really, really hard for people with disabilities to enter the workforce, and that they're more likely to leave employment than to enter it, but that they're also twice as likely to leave a job and to exit the labour force as those without a disability. And we can see from today's report that some of the measures under Make Work Pay are actually mentioned as being implemented, and we would point to the fact that there are 24 recommendations under that report, and that just 3 of them are being mentioned as being progressed. We would ask that in equality budgeting recommendations 3, for example, that provides for reasonable accommodation be reviewed, and that access to adequate aids, appliances and assistive technology in the workplace be very much revisited, along with revising the work adaptation grants and the whole concept of reasonable adaptation or reasonable accommodation to make it fit for purpose. And I'll leave my comments there. I'm very happy to answer any questions on any of these.
Okay, well, thank you very much, and can I thank you all collectively for that opening statement. It was very interesting. I'm now going to open up to some deputies who've indicated. So first I have Deputy Lahart.
Thanks, Chair. So I want to thank you for your public and community service. We tend not to wear political hats here, so we are coming at this from the budgetary oversight perspective, and there are a lot of competing demands, and we would meet over the course of a year people representing all the various competing demands. But I think it would be fair to say that the Chair and the committee have taken gender budgeting and disability budgeting to heart as one of the significant themes that we've dealt with in the last year. Brought it to the floor of the Dáil in the context of the report actually itself, that the produced a report, brought it to the floor of the Dáil, brought it to the attention of the Minister, and have raised it with the Minister, to encourage the Minister to go beyond just including a statement. So it's in that context, and it's one I think we have kept an eye on. There are a limited number of themes that we've gone through this year, and I think we've taken it very seriously and will continue to. And for some of us, for me, it was an eye-opening exercise, your first presentation, and we did continue it, and we engaged with the Scottish Parliament as well in relation, but I suppose that was more in relation to gender budgeting. So we have done quite a piece of work on it, and I don't think we'd be letting it go. And I am ashamed to say that, it opened my eyes. I wouldn't have been aware of the impact of budgetary measures or the lack of impact or the lack of consideration. So I think there's a consciousness developing, and I know you're clearly saying that's not enough, but it is a first step. I mean, what's interesting, the three deputies here, we're in the throes of local election campaigning at the moment, and what's really interesting, what came up after the referendum last year, for example, was the amount of polling stations that are selected still without disabled access. It's just kind of mad, that it's not in the consciousness of whoever is responsible for it, whether in my own county it's the county sheriff who selects. So it's something, that needs to be addressed. We would all have received calls on polling day of people being turned away. That's not good enough. Not being able to exercise their franchise. Maybe it doesn't seem like a big deal, but it is a big deal. So if the state is providing opportunities to, change the world, which we do in terms of referenda, they're pretty significant things from a democratic point of view, because it gives the public a right to a say, and certainly the most recent referenda have been fairly life-changing, have made life-changing decisions, and not being able to participate in that isn't good enough. The problem is it disappears then after 2 or 3 days. So that kind of highlights it. The figures you give, I suppose one of the things that I would ask is, just as deputies, proportionately do you think that people with disabilities are doing less well in terms of personal assistance hours? Because, I mean, we would be out the door in our relative HSE, CHO 7 area in terms of seeking home help hours for people, with early onset dementia, with all sorts, who wouldn't be classed as being disabled. So maybe you could answer that: are people with disabilities, who you class as people with disabilities, are they faring disproportionately less well? Okay, I've just put in a parliamentary question there now, and I'm sure my colleagues will do the same, just in relation to how many housing units were built, social housing units were built for people with disabilities. However, Deputy Brophy and myself were members of South Dublin County Council, and any of the new bills, just going on your figures, there, I mean, I would say that South Dublin County Council does between 5 to 10% of developments would be reserved for people with disabilities. You can't reserve a development sometimes of 5 units or 10 units, but anything like 30 to 40, there is always is always a unit or two. I don't know whether that's nationwide. And given the build nowadays, I think most houses are designed, anyway, social houses are designed to facilitate that. But put in, we'll see what the figure is back nationally. You mentioned, and I think this is something really useful, the technology role, assistive technology, you said in the workplace, I would say in the home place as well. We're fortunate we have Amazon out in in our constituency, they're working with the university hospital using their Alexa technology on a pilot basis to remind older patients, for example, when to take their tablets, when to take their exercise and things like that. So I think there's an increasing unexplored role of assistive technologies in the home. The equality of access to education, I think, is one that really needs exploring, and you might develop that a bit. I mean, this spreads to people who wouldn't be classed as people with disabilities, but with intellectual needs, ASD, Asperger's, autism, where traditional schools and traditionally established schools, they seem to be very difficult to access, whereas the new schools, the new state-built schools or the Educate Together schools, these are the ones who are most open. And this is something that really needs to be addressed, because it almost seems like a cultural barrier, an invisible kind of cultural barrier that's there. So my question, I suppose, from a budgetary oversight point of view is, we look at what the government spend and what the department spends and allocates. And taking your point on board, I suppose what I want to know is, are you faring proportionately less well than other groups who would have come before us and will come before us between now and budget time? That's the first question. What else do you think we can do?
Can I just interrupt you for a second, and apologies to you for this.
No worries.
I just want to see, Deputy Heydon, do you have a particular question? Because I appreciate you have to be gone from us inside 10 minutes.
No, you're fine.
Are you sure?
Yeah,
Okay,
I'm finished
sorry.
now anyway.
Yeah, that's perfect.
That's the first one. The second one is, we can only do so much, and remember, we can't provide services. We can't dictate, certainly in a report. We can continue to highlight, as we will, the need to take a step farther, we'll say, on from last year's budget in terms of gender and disability budgeting, to really increase that consciousness, to look at the 9 areas. And maybe we could chat about it on another occasion, say, look, how can we influence these departments that you're not actually doing enough here? This is something we're really serious about, and it's something that needs to be considered cross-departmentally in formulating your budget. It's not enough for the Minister for Finance and Public Expenditure to embrace it, which I think he does, and the need for it, but each Minister needs to get on side with that. So maybe you might have suggestions for it. Thanks, Chair.
No problem at all. Now, I don't know who wants to respond initially there, or, yep, work away, whichever.
So we might just divvy it up if that's okay. So we all have little. So do you want to start on the housing one first? Yeah.
Certainly. All right, so thank you so much for engaging so substantively with the points. I suppose just to pick up around social housing allocation, I believe what Deputy Lahart might be referring to is the Part M regulations and requirements around allocating certain proportions of certain size of developments for social housing, and then for types thereunder for people with disabilities. I suppose an issue to flag with the Part M regulations is that it requires that that a unit, and a unit of accommodation, whatever that may be, is for new builds, that it is visitable by a person with a disability, by a person in a wheelchair, for example, using a wheelchair. But visitable is a very different thing from livable. So perhaps a person may be able to get in the door, perhaps a person may be able to get into the living room or the kitchen, but is there access to the toilet? Is there access to the bedroom? Is there access to really have the full use and enjoyment of the house, and if there's a garden or whatever it may be, whatever the accommodation may be? So there are issues around that. There are issues as well around, I suppose, linking up the allocation, the requirement for accessible housing with the actual numbers and needs of social housing assessments. So significant inroads have been made in that. But for example, by moving the social housing needs assessment to a yearly instead of 3 yearly process, that will help in itself to give more informed detail. There's also been moves to try and link the allocations, I suppose, to thread through from what's called Housing Disability Steering Group, which would be informed by people with disabilities or people supporting people with disabilities, to try and inform the Council's planning and provision of social housing. And that will help as well, but that is all taking time to bed down. And in the interim period, the number of people who are having difficulties in accessing social housing, or private housing for that matter, is just building. So that is one thing just to flag. In terms then of whether or not people with disabilities are faring proportionately well in terms of housing, I think the answer to that is that actually they will be one of the next highest representation of people on the social housing waiting list after homelessness. We hear of a homelessness crisis. We don't hear of an inaccessible or inappropriate housing for people with disabilities crisis. But make no mistake about it, the lack of appropriate accommodation for people with disabilities is a crisis within a crisis. And as the government tries to implement its policies around decongregation, it needs accessible housing in the community. And if that isn't syncing up, all that's going to happen is pushing that blockage down the line. And actually, as well, there's I suppose coming back to that overlap in the budget proofing concept, 1 in 4 people who are homeless have a disability. But that's not how it's talked about. It's talked about homelessness is here, older persons is there, disability is there, and that's what it is, because that's the main basis on which assessment is allocated. There needs to be a rethinking.
Through the chair.
1 in 4 is actually from, I believe it's from a report from the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission. I think it was from 2018, but I'd be very happy to send it on. I'll verify that and I'll send it on. And there was a very significant piece of research done by Oireachtas at that time around the types of disability and where it's showing up as well. So it's not just mental health, which would be what a lot of people might think of in terms of homelessness. It can be physical and sensory and all types of intellectual, all different types of disability. So if that, I'll be happy to furnish that.
If you can, yes, send it on.
Certainly.
Does somebody else want to come in? Sorry, Joan.
Yes, thanks, Chair. I'd like to come back to your point, Deputy, about technology in not just in work but in the home. And I think we would very much agree with you that this is something that we really need to look at in Ireland. Ireland's approach and service provision for assistive technology to support people with disabilities of whatever age and older people to live independently, to access work and education, is lagging way behind other countries such as the UK, Australia, Denmark, etc. We would be internationally doing quite poorly in that regard, and DFI, along with Enable Ireland, have been doing a lot of work under the banner of Freedom Tech to ensure that we could actually model what would be an appropriate service, a complete ecosystem of supports that would actually support people to live independently, deal with transitions from school to work, because at the moment, for example, if you have technology supports while you are in school, you can't take that technology with you when you leave and take it into the workplace. The grants and access overall is quite poor. Trying to get hold of the technology to actually, for a smart home in order to be able to live independently is also quite difficult. And we, in 2017, published a discussion paper in conjunction with the entire, well, can't say the entire, but almost the entire disability sector, saying this is what we would like to see. I can make that available to you, no problem. But what we've also done is we have costed a pilot to roll out an assistive technology passport, which would be a one record of what somebody's assistive technology needs are, their support needs around it, their training needs and so on, that would be owned by the person themselves. So it would be putting people at the centre of their own expertise for their technology needs, which is exactly what the National Disability Authority is suggesting that we do with this. And we've costed a pilot project for that at 1.5 million, which I'm happy to share with you as well. We'd be very keen to see that that would be given consideration in budgeting oversight, to ensure that people can actually live independently and be in charge of their own lives. I think it's particularly critical in terms of work as well. The Department of Justice is due to roll out one of the Make Work Pay recommendations, which, as I mentioned before, is about ensuring that we have the grant schemes to support people in work, but the work on that hasn't commenced yet. So it's obviously got a budgetary implication, and we would be very keen to see that commenced. So definitely with you on the technology and seeing it progressed. Okay, Joanne.
Thanks, Deputy. I think you just spanned our whole organisation in terms of your questions. I think we'll have to go back to our colleague on the education one, because we could talk about it, but I don't feel we'd give you the right answers. But we'll come back to you with a written response on that. Specifically in terms of the PA, we were in front of the Health Committee last year only on this issue. Last year, yeah. And also it's formed a core part of DFI's work. I don't know if you've been following who we are, but we're really branded on community supports and infrastructures to enable people to live with dignity in their own homes and in communities. And we would think that this is possibly the most important service to enable people to live and to continue to live at home. Saying that, though, only 0.3% of people with disabilities are in receipt of a PA service. So it's a hugely lack of investment in terms of that particular service model. It's also, we don't really have very good data, because the reporting conflates PA and home supports. So you can't actually disaggregate the numbers of data, and we would suspect that any increase is really showing an increase in home supports more than PA. What we do know, however, from I think it's like 2017 data that we have managed to disaggregate somewhat, is that there's probably a little over 1,000 people in receipt of PA hours. Most of those, 900 odd of them, actually receive less than 5 hours a week. 5 hours a week. It's tiny. It's probably enough to get what we'll send you on the figures to make sure they're right, but that's from memory. So PA hours are a huge problem for people with disabilities. I think if you remember, most people with disabilities acquire it at working age. So 1 in 4 people will acquire a disability at working age. So most people aren't born with a disability. These people are already probably married, have their own homes, have their own jobs. In many cases, they're neurological, so they're progressive in nature, and so the need for services such as PA and home supports are critical to enable them to continue to live in their own home, to sustain family ties, to sustain a job, even if it is at a part-time basis. So we can't urge enough the need, especially in terms of a budgetary, if with your budgetary hat on, to find a way to understand the need and to put a budget to it. It's very difficult, though, because there is no live. The HSE don't keep waiting lists on PA. They stopped doing that a number of years ago. So we don't actually even know what the real need in the community is for people and for PA services. And the other thing that we do know is that oftentimes when people, if they have a relapse, end up in hospital, they will lose their PA hours, and so they can't even sustain tenancies that they may already have. And they're the people that end up in nursing homes. You would have seen recently, only last week on the paper, that young man who's in his 30s went into a hospital because he had a progressive onset of his condition. When he came out, he lost his PA hours and he ended up in a nursing home. We're doing a significant bit of research in DFI, looking at the 1,400 people under the age of 65 that are, we would say, many of whom are inappropriately placed in nursing homes. PA, again, being one of the critical elements to stopping them coming back out and living in the community. So, yeah, with your budget hat on, I think it'll be really important to begin to explore how best you can put sustained investment in a service that people with disabilities themselves highly value, and they are dependent on to be able to participate, to sustain, to live independently. Most of these people will only have a very small draw on the very expensive and heavy disability services programme that gets 1.9 million. So I think it's just important just to highlight, and I'm really glad, Deputy, that you brought it up. We'd be happy to come back and talk to you about it if you wanted.
Okay. Thank you. Sorry, you wanted to come back in there.
Thank you very much, Chair. Just to supplement on that as well from a budgetary perspective, excuse me, in terms of bang for your buck, I totally understand where you're coming from in terms of a budgetary oversight around you can't at this point say this is how you need to spend it, but it does come down to you can ask the questions and set the indicators that can really highlight that issue. And one way, again, in terms of personal assistance, linking it into housing. So I won't go through the whole social housing allocation process, but basically you apply, you're assessed, you're qualified, and then there's the allocation process. People with disabilities can be blocked from taking a social housing allocation. This could be years after being on the social housing waiting list, but they may be blocked from taking an allocation on the basis that they can't get PA, personal assistance hours. So there needs to be a sync up to ensure that these things are in a timely fashion happening and that there's actually the allocation is happening. And in a budgetary oversight way, then it's about asking, you know, there are questions that could go to that, like how many people are in receipt of it, how many have had delays in taking up social housing because of lack of community-based services. There are questions can be asked to inform.
I'm going to let Deputy Heydon in there briefly, and I know you have to have a meeting starting well now, actually, about a minute ago.
I looked at the clock, it was 5:15 and I have loads of time, and actually I should have took you when you were offered when he came in. So just to say briefly, sorry, I do have the chair meeting now, so I was speaking in the Dáil earlier on a question, so I missed the start of your presentation, but I had read through your opening statement, and the overriding points that come through to me are very clear, and I think it's something as we as a committee must raise back with the department is, you know, to have those figures. You refer to the nebulous information that's actually really, really important to drill down, because it's not just the hours, how many people are getting hours, it's the quality of those hours and how they're going through. The one thing that struck me about all of that information is that it's very hard in a budgetary process ever to be able to calculate the positive impacts that early intervention in any scenario, or early support, as you say, for relatively very small money, can prevent very significant costs in terms of healthcare, in terms of mental health, in terms of active living. Is there ways, international best practice, where we can somehow try to, you know, quantify that, you know, spend a small amount of money now, and sorry, we are at risk of sounding desensitised here because this is real people and their lives, but in terms of the budgetary process, for us to be able to make the argument for our constituents all around the country who we deal with on a daily basis, who face all of these challenges of independent living, of wanting to pursue their lives and their goals and dreams like any of us would, how best do we make that argument, because we know it makes sense to invest a small amount now and that the economic returns are huge, never mind the societal and all the rest. And if there is best practice in that regard, that's one key point that would touch on me, and I think as a committee we'll take the points that you've raised in your presentation today and feed them into the work that we do in our engagement with the department in the future, and thank you for your presentation.
Joan is probably going to pick that up. We've just recently done a submission where we've been struggling with this, and Joan we have a very interesting project that...
just really, really briefly, delighted to hear you say that. Our organisations deliver services on the ground, or member organisations that aren't even covered or understood by service agreements, which is the contract they signed by the HSE, because they're very much in the nature of soft services and so on. And as Joanne points out, we've been grappling with this for a number of years. We have an application now in under Sláinte Care, so we've got our fingers crossed for that. And we have been in contact with some people who can use, in NUI Galway and also in Scotland, who can use systems dynamics modelling, a process which actually shows what happens when you move one part of the system. So if you take a support away, what impact that might have on acute admissions, on nursing home admissions and so on. So we've got our fingers crossed that we might actually be back here this time next year telling you exactly what the impact is this, but obviously that is also budgetary issues, so if we don't get that funding we might be back to you for the overall.
That is powerful, because if you can catalogue and say in financial terms that the lack of PA hours there costs this much in acute health services.
That's exactly what happens, they end up in nursing homes.
And unfortunately they're calculated probably as two, they're not joined as figures now, and I can see that. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Deputy Heydon. Thank you very much. Now, I just have, I suppose, just one or two, because Deputy Lahart has covered a lot in the areas which he did. I want to really zone in on, I suppose, one or two things that specific are to us. So the first really is the feedback. I mean, have you or your organisation got any type of feedback on the assessment of last year's budget, a post-budget assessment, I suppose, in the impact of it for people living with disability. Was there any groups or organisations that feed into you that have done any looking at that in relation to 2019? So that would be the first thing, because that's obviously critically important into helping us on this year. The second thing links to that again, and it type of follows on what Deputy Heydon's comment was as well, in terms of similar processes in other parliaments. So international best practice in terms of disability proofing budgets. Is there anything that you've picked up and that you could feed into us, either that's evolved in the last 12 months or in terms of where we're going ourselves with our work as a committee and where government is going with its work on it? So that's really the two areas on it. They're very micro to the committee's work, but they're really at the heart of what we're doing. Last year's feedback, international best practice to take us forward for this year. So I'll open it up to whoever wants to come back to me first.
Joan, do you want to do the first one?
Well, they're both very good questions, and we really do welcome them. I suppose one of the things in terms of best practice and so on is that since 1998, we here in Ireland have got measures to create poverty impact assessments, which were set up by the Office for Social Inclusion inside the Department of Employment and Social Protection. So whilst they were looking at poverty, the actual assessment is designed to be taken on board by all government departments, and it sits under the National Action Plan for Social Inclusion. We would hope that we've got a strengthened commitment under the new National Action Plan, which is we're expecting will be announced next Wednesday, the 22nd, and that there will be stronger measures put in place. We would say that we would welcome a strengthening of that muscle, really, via public expenditure and reform, to make sure that all government departments are actually poverty-proofing and disability equality proofing budgets in advance of making budgetary decisions, so that those metrics can come into play when making budgetary decisions. At the moment, the poverty impact assessment is done only within the Department of Social Protection, maybe one or two other departments, I can't be certain, but it's done after the budget rather than informing budgetary decisions. Does that make sense? So that would be my comment on that.
If I may come in, I suppose just to develop on the point of international best practice, really the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities is all about linking in with the lived experience with people with disabilities, and there is avenues for that within this budgetary process. I suppose we flagged in our submission, for example, the advisory group that has been established. There are some great insights already evident and experts on that group, but there, to our knowledge, there's no disability-specific representation and insight, and that's the benefit of that, as I hope that we portrayed in last year's submission, is that really it gives that insight into just the lived experience of where something actually operates in practice. So that's what we'd be really encouraging, is to try and work that in a systematic way, the direct consultation. Wider than that, actually disability proofing is broader in its infancy around the world. There are examples of it. A lot of the writings on it that I found have actually built on the gender proofing initiatives. So it really develops on that. So, and I know that this initiative is very much developing on it as well. But just to say that again, they're really the best people to give the insights on how to expand that are people with disabilities themselves. In terms of the budgetary evaluation on last year, we did ourselves do, I suppose, an internal assessment of what the measures were, where they, I suppose, how they measured up in terms of what we would have been hoping to see and looking for and asking for. So we'd be happy to tidy that up for external and send it on to yourselves for your consideration. And I hope that that would be of some assistance. I suppose one last thing that I would point to, just in terms of international best practice, by way of example of where we see these things happening. The European Union has actually ratified the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities as well. So the EU as a legal entity has responsibilities, same as Ireland now does ourselves from ratifying, but also Ireland has responsibilities under that. Why is that relevant? Because the EU has already been through the assessment, so the review by the United Nations Committee, and that committee has given recommendations. And one of the recommendations specifically went around how you're allocating funding, particularly around what the EU calls deinstitutionalisation is what we call decongregation. And it said that, you know, the EU actually has to look at putting in criteria around where it will actually give funding, so that it will only give funding to initiatives that are compliant with the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and that it would actually have oversight throughout that process, and that it will review, is it being used in line with what the application procedure, and if not, are there ramifications? And it went so far as to recommend that actually funding might have to be cut off where it's not being used. So it's not exactly equality budget proofing, but there are examples of where it's being thread throughout and having to be looked over, and where oversight is being practiced in terms of implementation. So I'd be happy to send you on a bit of documentation about that.
Just to say, so I think that's a really interesting question, but I love the first one, I suppose. I love the more high-level stuff, and the thing about the feedback from the budget, you know, from last year. I suppose one of the key concerns from DFI was the fact that we can see, when you look in from the top down, that it would look to us, one of our analysis or assessments is that increasingly the disability budget is being consolidated around both that core disability group, so that 27,000 people, and that's 8,500 people in day services. And there's very little available within HSC disability spend. It's because that's where they see is under Section 38, and that's their funding, it's the vote. What they see is their core responsibility under the vote. And so increasing over time, that our analysis is that there's been a greater consolidation around how they spend their money, specifically around that. Even though the policy is towards mainstreaming community, support people to live in the community, the services that are required to enable a person to do that, such as the PA, the home supports, the respite, they receive little to no investment through the budgetary process. Do you know what I mean? Because it gets eaten up. I think it's an important one for us to understand that. I suppose the other thing that we'd like to say as well is the fact, and it's something that DFI has been very strong on for a while, is that when you plan for budgets in a singular way, so when you plan department by department for a budget, you have unexpected consequences can happen. And so we were involved in an initiative here within the Oireachtas this January last year, where 3 departments came together, and that was employment, education and health, and they began to look at what were some of the cross themes that happen. We've again managed to, I suppose, unearth that we're part of the ODG, the Oireachtas Disability Group, and only about a week ago, or maybe 2 weeks ago, maybe I got my timescales wrong, we were in where Taoiseachs actually brought in the Secretary Generals of each department with the ODG to talk about how you could look at getting sustainable change, looking at the links that happen across departments. So I suppose our findings and our analysis and what we're hearing back from our members is that if you only look at a particular measure but don't actually stitch that with another measure that has a relationship with. So for example, I'm going to give, just because we talk this policy term all the time, but a perfect example was the access to assistive technology. Deputy Lahart, you brought this up earlier. So when you can have assistive technology within primary school, within secondary school, when you transition into post-primary, unless it's a recognised third level college, you won't have access, you will not get resource to access technology there. And even if you do at third level, once you finish, then you hand back that technology and you have to reapply through the job when you go back to work, when you enter into the workforce. So there's no assistive technology passport that shadows the person to make it easy to transition from those points. And they're critical things that when you're doing budgets, that you can actually plan in your head. So.
Okay, thank you. I was going towards conclusion, but we've enjoyed. I don't know if there's anything you want to particularly ask, Deputy, or.
Well, I mean, I'd say you discussed it. Unfortunately, I was caught with doing business questions up there. So anyway, welcome to the committee. And obviously, we have to consider very carefully, I suppose, the key recommendations that you'll bring forward. So.
We're happy to bring further information on anything.
Yeah.
For your information, can I say it was a very interesting exchange and set of questions. Any additional information which you're supplying in relation to any deputy, if you could make it available to the secretaries of the committee, so as we can ensure that all deputies can access it. So I would like to thank you, Dr. McCarthy, Ms O'Donovan, Ms O'Donnell, for your contributions today. With our committee, as there is no further business, will now stand adjourned until Tuesday the 28th of May at 4 p.m. Thank you very much.